The text message arrived while I was reviewing tenant applications at my office. Family Thanksgiving at our house this year. 4 p.m. sharp. Don't be late. Margaret. Margaret, my mother-in-law, had a way of turning every invitation into a summons. After 3 years of marriage to her daughter Emily, I'd learned that family gatherings were less about gratitude and more about establishing pecking orders within the Collins family hierarchy. I locked my desk drawer containing lease agreements for my 34 rental properties and headed home to pick up Emily. She was waiting in our modest apartment, looking beautiful in the burgundy dress she'd chosen specifically because it makes Mom happy when I make an effort. Ready for the annual interrogation? Emily asked, only half joking as we drove toward her parents' suburban neighborhood. I've survived 2 years of it. I think I can handle one more. What Emily didn't know, what none of her family knew, was that I owned the property management company that handled their rental house, along with dozens of others throughout the city. Sterling Property Management had been quietly successful for 6 years, but I preferred keeping my business private. It eliminated complications in personal relationships and allowed me to assess people's character without the filter of their financial motivations. The Collins family had always been status conscious in a way that felt performative. Margaret worked as a bank teller but spoke as if she were a regional manager. Emily's father Robert managed a small auto parts store but presented himself as a business owner. Emily's brother Derek was a part-time personal trainer who described himself as a fitness entrepreneur. They lived in a rented 4-bedroom house in an upscale neighborhood, driving leased cars and maintaining appearances that required constant financial juggling. None of this was inherently problematic, except for their need to position themselves as superior to anyone they perceived as less successful. Since I appeared to be a regular property management employee living in a small apartment, I'd become their favorite example of insufficient ambition and limited prospects. We arrived at 4:03 p.m. to find cars already filling the driveway. Derek's leased BMW, Aunt Patricia's nearly new Lexus, Cousin Brandon's lifted truck. I parked my reliable Honda Civic behind the garbage cans, maintaining my role as the family's cautionary tale. There's the renter, Derek announced as we entered the foyer, his voice carrying the fond condescension reserved for amusing family failures. Still living in that tiny apartment downtown? Still enjoying the convenience of urban living, I replied, hanging my coat in the closet. Margaret emerged from the kitchen wearing the forced smile she reserved for greeting people she tolerated rather than welcomed. James, so good of you to join us. Emily, darling, you look lovely. The message was clear. Emily was family, I was a guest whose attendance was noted rather than celebrated. The house smelled like turkey and Margaret's signature passive aggression. Family members clustered in the living room, catching up on gossip and comparing recent purchases. The conversation followed predictable patterns. Who'd gotten promoted, who'd bought new cars, who was planning expensive vacations. Brandon just put an offer on a house, Aunt Patricia announced proudly. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, beautiful neighborhood. Brandon beamed at the recognition. At 28 he'd finally scraped together a down payment for a starter home, an achievement the family was treating as evidence of superior life planning. That's wonderful, Emily said genuinely. Homeownership is such an important milestone. Exactly, Margaret interjected, shooting a meaningful look in my direction. Building equity instead of throwing money away on rent. Creating stability for the future. I nodded politely, having learned that defending renting as a valid lifestyle choice only provided fuel for lectures about real estate investment and building generational wealth. Derek joined the conversation with the enthusiasm of someone who'd watched several property investment YouTube videos. The thing about renting is you're basically paying someone else's mortgage. You're making them rich while building nothing for yourself. It's fine for college students, Robert added, but eventually you need to think about building something permanent. I sipped my beer and maintained neutral expression, curious about where this was heading. The family's financial advice sessions were always entertaining, especially since their own fiscal decisions suggested limited understanding of wealth-building strategies. Dinner was served with the usual production. Margaret's best china, carefully arranged place cards, formal dining room reserved for special occasions. I found myself seated between Emily and her 12-year-old cousin, safely away from the adults' table where important family business was discussed. The meal progressed through standard holiday conversation topics. Work updates, neighborhood gossip, political opinions carefully modulated to avoid genuine disagreement. But as the wine flowed and comfort levels increased, The conversation inevitably turned to the subject Margaret had clearly been preparing all evening. James, she said during a lull in conversation, Emily mentioned you're still renting that little apartment downtown. Have you given any thought to buying a place? The question wasn't casual inquiry. It was the opening salvo in a coordinated campaign. I could see Emily tense beside me, anticipating the familiar pattern of her family's helpful advice. We've discussed it, I said diplomatically. The apartment meets our needs right now. But it's so small, Margaret continued. And expensive, I'm sure. Downtown rent prices are outrageous. You could probably get a mortgage payment for less than what you're paying in rent. Derek nodded sagely. Plus you'd be building equity instead of just throwing money away. Robert joined the offensive. A man needs to think about providing stability for his wife. Emily deserves a real home, not some temporary rental situation. I felt Emily's hand touch mine under the table, a small gesture of support that reminded me why I tolerated these gatherings. Real estate is the foundation of financial security, Aunt Patricia added. People who rent their whole lives never build wealth. Margaret's expression suggested this was exactly the opening she'd been waiting for. That's what worries me about Emily's future. She's 32 years old, married to someone who doesn't seem interested in building anything permanent. The room fell quiet except for the soft clink of silverware against china. Even the 12-year-old seemed to sense that adult drama was unfolding. Mom, Emily said quietly, James and I are happy with our living situation. Happiness doesn't pay for retirement, sweetheart. Your father and I worked hard to build equity in our home. We understand the importance of real estate investment. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife, considering they were renting the house where this conversation was taking place. But family mythology often superseded actual facts. Maybe James doesn't understand how real estate works, Derek suggested with the condescending helpfulness of someone explaining simple concepts to slow children. I could show you some properties in our price range. Nothing fancy but starter homes that would get you building equity. Our price range, I repeated quietly. Well, realistic options for someone in property management. Entry-level stuff. Robert cleared his throat importantly. The thing is, James, our daughter deserves better than a renter. She grew up in a family that values ownership, stability, building something lasting. Margaret nodded emphatically. Emily could have married any number of successful men. Doctors, lawyers, business owners. Men who understand the importance of providing security. Instead, she continued, building momentum for her prepared speech, she chose someone who seems content with temporary arrangements. I looked around the table at faces that ranged from sympathetic embarrassment to eager anticipation of my response. Emily's eyes were bright with angry tears she was too polite to shed in front of her family. I understand your concerns, I said carefully. You want Emily to be financially secure. Exactly, Margaret said, mistaking my acknowledgement for agreement. We want her to have the kind of life she deserves. The kind of life we've worked to provide. Which is why, Robert added, we hope you'll seriously consider making some changes. Emily's not getting any younger, and if you want children someday... Children need stability, Margaret interrupted. They need to grow up in homes their parents own, in neighborhoods with good schools, with the security that comes from building equity. Derek was nodding like this was the wisest financial advice ever dispensed. It's really just about priorities, man. Do you want to spend your whole life making other people rich, or do you want to build something for your own family? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel the family's collective expectation that I would either defend my rental lifestyle or promise to change my obviously flawed approach to financial planning. You're right about priorities, I said finally. Building security for Emily is definitely important to me. Margaret's expression brightened, mistaking my agreement for capitulation. I'm so glad you understand. We were beginning to worry that you didn't take these things seriously. Oh, I take real estate very seriously, I assured her. Good, Robert said. Because a man who can't provide basic homeownership isn't ready for marriage, in my opinion. A renter will always be at someone else's mercy, Aunt Patricia added. Landlords can raise rent, refuse to renew leases, sell properties. Tenants have no control over their housing situation. I nodded thoughtfully. Landlords do have a lot of power in those relationships. Exactly, Margaret said triumphantly. Which is why homeownership is so important. You need to stop making excuses and start taking action. Emily had been quiet throughout this exchange, But now she spoke up with barely controlled anger. Mom, you're being incredibly rude. James works hard and our living situation is none of your business. It becomes our business when our daughter is married to someone who won't provide basic security, Margaret replied. Emily, you deserve a husband who can buy you a real house. What exactly defines a real house? I asked, genuinely curious about her criteria. Something permanent, Derek answered. Something you own instead of rent. Something that builds equity and provides stability. Something like this house? I gestured around the dining room. Exactly, Margaret said proudly. Robert and I understand the importance of real estate investment. We've built equity in this property for 8 years. I paused, looking around the table at expectant faces waiting for me to acknowledge their superior financial wisdom. That's interesting, I said slowly. Because according to my records, you've been renting this house for 8 years, not building equity. The silence was immediate and complete. Margaret's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Robert's confident expression flickered with confusion. What do you mean? Derek asked. I mean your rent checks come to Sterling Property Management every month. Have for 8 years. Along with the late fees when payments arrive after the 5th. Margaret's face went through several color changes as she processed what I'd said. That's impossible. How would you know about our rent payments? Because I own Sterling Property Management. This house along with 33 others throughout the city. The revelation hit the table like a physical force. Derek dropped his fork with a clatter. Aunt Patricia choked on her wine. Robert stared at me as if I'd announced I was actually an alien visitor. You can't, Margaret whispered. You work in property management. You rent an apartment. I own a property management company. I choose to rent an apartment because I travel frequently for business and prefer investing my money in properties rather than personal residences. Emily was staring at me with a mixture of shock and something that might have been admiration. You own this house? I own this house, I confirmed. Purchased it as an investment property 9 years ago. Your parents have been excellent tenants, generally speaking. The word tenants seemed to hit Margaret like a slap. But you said, you never mentioned. You never asked what I did for work. You assumed I was an employee rather than a business owner, and I saw no reason to correct that assumption. Robert found his voice, though it came out strangled. How many properties did you say you own? 34 rental properties. 12 single-family homes, 18 duplexes for small apartment buildings. Total portfolio value approximately $12.7 million. The number seemed to physically impact the family. Derek's mouth hung open. Aunt Patricia had gone completely pale. This is impossible, Margaret insisted. If you were wealthy, you'd live differently. You'd have a nice car, expensive clothes, a big house. I have a reliable car, quality clothes, and I can afford any house I want. I choose to live modestly because flashy displays of wealth don't interest me. I looked around the table at faces struggling to process this information. The apartment Emily and I share downtown? I own the building. We live there because it's convenient and because I prefer investing surplus income in additional properties rather than personal luxury. Just then the doorbell rang. Margaret jumped as if she'd been shot, still reeling from the revelations about my business ownership. I'll get it, Robert mumbled, clearly grateful for any excuse to leave the table. We could hear voices in the foyer, then Robert's footsteps returning with increasing speed. Margaret, he called from the doorway, his face ashen. There's someone here to see us. Behind him appeared a woman I recognized as Karen Martinez, my assistant property manager who handled tenant communications and payment processing. Mr. and Mrs. Collins, Karen said professionally, I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but we need to discuss your overdue rent payment. Margaret looked like she was going to faint. Overdue. Your November payment was due on the 1st with a grace period until the 5th. Today is November 23rd and we still haven't received payment. According to our records, this is the 4th late payment this year. Derek was looking back and forth between Karen and me with dawning comprehension. Wait, she works for you? Karen manages day-to-day tenant relations, I confirmed, including payment collection and lease enforcement. Karen continued her professional presentation, unaware of the family drama she'd interrupted. Mr. and Mrs. Collins, your lease includes a clause about chronic late payments. 4 late payments in a calendar year triggers a lease review process. Robert slumped into his chair. We can pay tomorrow. I just need to transfer some funds. That's what you said last month, Karen replied, consulting her tablet. And the month before. Sterling Property Management has been very patient, but we need to see consistent on-time payments going forward. Margaret was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Horror, embarrassment, and perhaps the beginning of understanding. Karen, I said quietly, this is my wife's family. Perhaps we could discuss payment arrangements after dinner. Karen's professional demeanor flickered with surprise. Of course, Mr. Sterling. I didn't realize. I'll wait in the car. As Karen left, the dining room fell back into complete silence. The Collins family was processing not just my wealth revelation, but the mortifying reality that their landlord had just witnessed their lecture about my supposed financial inadequacy. You're Sterling, Emily said slowly. Sterling Property Management. James Sterling, I confirmed. I've been using my middle name socially since college. Seems simpler than explaining the business connection. Margaret found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. How long have you known we were your tenants? Since before Emily and I started dating. I recognized the address when she gave me directions to pick her up. And you never said anything? What was I supposed to say? Hi, I'm dating your daughter and I'm also your landlord? That seemed like it would complicate things unnecessarily. Derek was shaking his head in disbelief. So when we've been giving you advice about real estate, I've been listening to tenants explain homeownership strategies to their landlord. Yes. Robert cleared his throat painfully. The late payments are between Sterling Property Management and our tenants. They don't affect my personal relationships. But even as I said it, we all knew that line had been permanently blurred. I need some air, Margaret announced, standing abruptly and walking toward the back door. Robert followed her, muttering something about checking his bank balance. Derek excused himself to make a phone call, probably to his girlfriend to explain why Thanksgiving dinner had imploded. Emily and I sat alone at the table, surrounded by half-eaten turkey and the debris of her family's shattered assumptions. Why didn't you tell me? She asked quietly. Would it have changed anything between us? I don't know. Maybe. It's a lot to process. I reached for her hand. I'm the same person I was this morning. The same person you married. I just happen to own more real estate than your family realized. Emily was quiet for a long moment, staring at her wedding ring. They're never going to recover from this, are they? Through the kitchen window we could see Margaret and Robert in intense conversation on the back patio. Margaret was gesturing dramatically while Robert held his phone, probably calculating how quickly they could make their overdue rent payment. They'll adapt, I said. People usually do when their assumptions get challenged by reality. Mom's been bragging to her friends about living in this neighborhood for years. She's been pretending they own the house. They can keep pretending if that makes them happy. I'm not going to announce their rental status to the world. Emily squeezed my hand. You could have humiliated them completely. Why didn't you? Because they're your family. And because everyone deserves dignity, even when they're being judgmental about other people's life choices. The back door opened and Margaret returned, followed by Robert. Their expressions suggested they'd reached some kind of decision during their private conversation. James, Margaret said formally, we owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. We do, Robert added. We made assumptions about your situation without knowing the facts. That was unfair and rude. Margaret sat back down, looking older than she had an hour earlier. We were worried about Emily's future. We thought you weren't ambitious enough for her. I understand wanting the best for Emily. That's not something I'd ever criticize. But we went about it wrong, Margaret continued. We made judgments based on appearances rather than character. Derek returned from his phone call, looking sheepish. So, I guess you probably don't need my advice about starter homes. Probably not, I agreed gently. The remainder of the evening passed quietly. Karen had left after I assured her the payment situation would be resolved promptly. The family slowly reassembled for dessert, but the dynamic had shifted permanently. Conversation was subdued and careful. Margaret asked polite questions about my business, clearly trying to recalibrate her understanding of my place in the family hierarchy. Robert inquired about property management strategies with genuine curiosity rather than condescension. Derek seemed mostly impressed that someone he'd been treating as a cautionary tale was actually more successful than anyone at the table. As Emily and I prepared to leave, Margaret pulled me aside. The rent, she said quietly. We'll have it to you tomorrow. And we'll be on time going forward. Margaret, business and family are separate things. Sterling Property Management has policies, but they're not personal. I know. But we want to be good tenants. We like this house. I nodded. It's a good house. You've taken excellent care of it. She smiled. The first genuine smile she'd directed at me in 3 years of family gatherings. Emily's lucky to have you, she said. I'm sorry it took us so long to see that. As we drove home, Emily was quiet until we reached downtown. Are you upset that I didn't tell you? I asked. No, she said slowly. I think I understand why you kept it private. People treat you differently when they know you have money. Exactly. Tonight was a perfect example of how assumptions about wealth can overshadow actual character assessment. My family really embarrassed themselves, didn't they? They showed they care about your future. The approach was flawed, but the motivation was love. Emily laughed for the first time since dinner. You're being very generous about people who spent the evening insulting your lifestyle choices. They weren't insulting me, Emily. They were expressing fears about your security and happiness. Parents are supposed to worry about those things. We parked outside our apartment building, the building I owned but had never mentioned owning, and took the elevator to our modest unit that suddenly seemed less like evidence of limited success and more like a conscious choice about lifestyle priorities. What happens now? Emily asked as we got ready for bed. Nothing changes between us. Your family might treat me differently at future gatherings, but that's their adjustment to make. And the late rent payments? Karen will work with them on a payment plan if needed. Sterling Property Management has policies about chronic lateness, but they're designed to protect property investments, not punish good tenants who hit temporary rough patches. Emily was quiet for a moment. You really don't care about impressing people, do you? I care about impressing you. Everyone else's opinions are secondary. That night, I lay awake thinking about family dynamics and the stories people tell themselves about success and failure. Margaret and Robert weren't bad people. They were parents worried about their daughter's future, operating with incomplete information and making decisions based on assumptions rather than facts. The Collins family would adjust to this new reality. Margaret would probably brag to her friends about her son-in-law's business success, conveniently forgetting her previous concerns about my ambition. Robert would ask for investment advice and home maintenance tips. Derek might request job opportunities or business mentorship. But Emily and I would remain essentially unchanged. We'd still live in our convenient apartment, drive reliable cars and make decisions based on our values rather than other people's expectations. The difference was that future family gatherings would be less stressful, now that everyone understood that financial security wasn't something I lacked, but something I'd achieved through methods they hadn't recognized. Sometimes the most satisfying revelations aren't about proving people wrong, but about helping them understand that success comes in many forms, and that making assumptions about other people's lives usually reveals more about the assumers than the assumed.